As you know, heart disease is the #1 cause of premature mortality here in the US and throughout the world. In today's show, we're going to talk about how consumption of ultra-processed foods are the main driver behind the high incidence of cardiovascular disease. This is a 27-year follow-up study titled Higher Ultra-Processed Food Consumption is Associated with Incident Risk of Incident Coronary Artery Disease in the Atherosclerosis Risk in Communities study. So this is the ARIC cohort that has been tracked for over 27 years. There's 15,000 subjects in this particular cohort. They're comprised of 4 different regions throughout the US, and I think they've been surveyed 6 or 7 times over the past 27 years. And in short, this article and this follow-up prospective study finds that higher consumption of ultra-processed foods, which we will define very shortly, especially the problematic foods, sugar-sweetened beverages, bakery products, sugary snacks, fats and oils like corn oil, canola oil, cottonseed oil, etc., are the main risk factors in problematic foods, exacerbating the prevalence of coronary artery disease and initiating atherosclerosis, which is the formation of clotting and the narrowing or occlusion of the very small coronary arteries. So I think it's really important for people to understand, because when you go to your doctor, they are looking at your LDL cholesterol, your low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, and making clinical assertions based upon that level of LDL cholesterol. But it turns out that you can have normal LDL cholesterol and still have atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And so we need to focus and reframe the conversation to sugar and the consumption of ultra-processed foods. And as this article talks about, and we're going to dive into shortly, it seems that these foods mechanistically perturb the metabolic and cardiometabolic environment through the microbiome by perturbing the gut bacteria, creating chronic low-grade inflammation, among many other mechanisms that then increase the susceptibility for your arteries and your vessels to become clogged. And I think that's important for us to acknowledge, because a healthy microbiome, healthy gut affects chronic inflammation and immune system function. But let's dive into the details of this fascinating study about how your arteries get clogged when you consume junk food. The scientists say, in conclusion, in this study of middle-aged US adults, higher ultra-processed food consumption was associated with a higher risk of coronary artery disease. Our findings confirm the associations between ultra-processed food intake and cardiovascular disease found in other study populations. Given the rise in ultra-processed food consumption, which, lest I remind you, is about 60% of the calories that most people consume here in America, come from these ultra-processed foods. Given the rise in ultra-processed food consumption and correlated trend in obesity in recent years, our study supports considering levels of food processing in national dietary guidelines. In addition, these findings provide justification for clinicians to advise their patients to limit consumption of ultra-processed food. Although further research is necessary to confirm our results in longitudinal studies using universally agreed upon ultra-processed food definitions and classifications, it is warranted to further explore the relevant mechanisms underlying the association between ultra-processed foods and coronary artery disease. So let's fast forward to figure 1. As you can see here, the proportion of each food group contributing to the frequency of ultra-processed food consumption. We have bakery goods, beverages, fats, and oils comprise more than 50% of the problematic foods. So if you want to prevent cardiovascular disease, it's not the red meat necessarily or the dairy. It is the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, bakery goods, sugar, alcohol, fried foods, cereals, fats, and oils. These are the problematic foods that you see in the grocery carts of people at the store who have the visceral adiposity, the increased belly fat mass, that are overweight and pre-diabetic and have high blood pressure and all of the things. So figure 1 really highlights the foods that we should be avoiding. And it's not necessarily the red meat. And I think this is really hard for people to wrap their minds around, because they have been told over and over again, thanks to Ansel Keys and scientists from Harvard that have been paid by the sugar industry and the Sugar Research Foundation back in the 1960s, which we've talked about in other videos. You know, the science has been muddled from industry influence. So people perceive the problem foods to be red meat, butter, and dairy products, when in reality, it's the convenience ultra-processed foods that are the problem. Now, before we talk about even more granular details here about the increased risk and the increased incidence of atherosclerosis corresponding with different amounts of processed food consumption, I just want to say I appreciate you all being here. If you're enjoying the content, hit that like button. Thank you for sharing this video with a friend who is trying to better their health, but is still consuming ultra-processed foods, because we know them to be the reason why people are having coronary artery disease and clogged arteries. Also, since I mentioned the gut microbiome is really, really important to your cardiometabolic health, a natural tool that has been used in traditional Chinese medicine for the past 3,000 years is berberine hydrochloride. This is one of the most effective natural products that can help support metabolic health. It also incidentally helps with food cravings. There's been over 250 reviews over at our sister company, myoscience.com, from people just like you using this to curb the evening food cravings for the sugar-sweetened beverages, for the baked goods, the ice cream, and sugary snacks. So if you struggle with your evening food cravings and you want to kickstart your fast and get yourself into a state of nutritional ketosis, check out the Berberine Fasting Accelerator over at myoscience.com. That's MYOXCIENCE.com. And you can save with the code podcast at checkout. So let's get back into the study details, and I want to share with you figure 2 here, which really helps convey the story about why consuming more than 4 servings of sugar-sweetened beverages, baked goods, sugary snacks, fats, and oils are problematic for the vessels in your heart and risk of future cardiovascular disease. But I think it's important to look at how was coronary artery disease defined in this 27-year follow-up study. The scientists say coronary artery disease incidence was defined as the first occurrence of a definite or probable hospitalization due to myocardial infarction or heart attack, or definite coronary artery disease death. Definite or probable MI hospitalization was identified by chest pain, cardiac enzyme concentrations, and echocardiogram readings. Definite CAD death was defined based upon a combination of chest pain symptoms, medical history, and relevant ICD-9 codes. Now, as I mentioned, these 15,000 participants were studied between 1987 and 2019, and there were 6 follow-up visits. So these subjects were tracked for a number of years, almost 30 some odd years. Now, here's figure 3 that I was alluding to here. Now, what you see is the hazard ratio, and this is after adjusting for all sorts of other factors. When individuals consume more than 7 servings of sugar-sweetened beverages, fats and oils, sugary snacks, baked goods, ice cream, cookies, crackers, treats, pretzels, all of the junk food, right, that we all grew up eating, cereals and all this trash, the more that is consumed, essentially more than 8 servings, or between 7 and 8 servings per day, as you can see in the gray histogram, where it intersects with this black solid line. That shows a 20% increase in the risk of developing coronary artery disease. Now, that risk only increases up to about 30% when individuals start consuming about 15 servings per day, which I think is quite interesting. But in brief, the less that you consume of these sugar-sweetened beverages, sugary snacks, baked goods, cookies, crackers, treats, pretzels, and fried foods, the lower your odds are of developing coronary artery disease. Now, I think this is important because this is independent of cholesterol content of the foods and whether they're plant-based or animal-based. The fact is, these foods are highly processed. So if you want to avoid the number one reason why most people die prematurely, which is cardiovascular disease, you need to just consume real food. It's not so much the butter. It's not so much the cholesterol from the whole eggs or raw dairy or red meat. It is the processed foods which are problematic. So here are the results from this 27-year follow-up study. The investigators write there were 2,006 incident coronary artery disease cases documented over the median follow-up period of 27 years. Incidence rates were higher in the highest quartile of ultra-processed food intake. Participants in the highest compared with the lowest quartile of ultra-processed food intake had a 19% higher risk of coronary artery disease. The hazard ratio was 1.19. After adjusting for socio-demographic factors and health behaviors, an approximately linear relation was observed between ultra-processed food intake and risk of coronary artery disease. Now, again, this is important to remember because there's a big push by Stanford, by Harvard, to get you to eat a plant-based diet. Most of these plant-based foods, lest I remind you, are ultra-processed foods. I think this is really a big point of contention with many of us in the whole food, the community that is pushing for consumption of whole foods, whether that comes from plant-based whole foods or animal-based whole foods. We just want people eating whole, real foods. But most people, now I'm not saying everyone, but most people, when they go on a plant-based diet, they start increasing the consumption of processed vegan junk food. And we know, as this article and many other articles, there was a NutraSanti study from Spain. There was another cohort in Spain tracked for over 6 years, again, finding that ultra-processed foods are not only linked with higher all-cause mortality. This was a 39% higher risk of all-cause mortality over the course of 6 years. This study over 27 years finds a higher incidence of coronary artery disease. We have diabetes, we have obesity. All of these are related to packaged processed foods. It's not necessarily the red meat, my friend. So that's the big take-home message here. If you want to get healthier, learn to cook food from scratch. Go to the farmer's market, get some potatoes if you want, some onions, some grass-fed beef, some eggs, some butter, some raw dairy, and start to learn how to cook food from scratch using whole food ingredients. That is what is most important. Now, this is where I want to get into the granular details a little bit. Now, there's a lot of big multi-syllabic words here talking about some of the harms and mechanistically why this may be linked, why these foods may be linked with increased risk of coronary artery disease. Emulsifiers like carboxymethylcellulose may influence the gut microbiome environment. This is found in ultra-processed foods and may lead to low-grade intestinal inflammation, at least in animals. Environmental chemicals from plastic food packaging for ultra-processed foods may also play an important role in evaluating the risk of coronary artery disease. One study using data from a nationally representative sample of the U.S. adults in the NHANES found that urine concentrations of certain phthalates and bisphenols, or chemicals linked with obesity and diabetes, were higher among those in the highest compared with the lowest quartiles of ultra-processed food intake. So it may not just be the sugar and the refined seed oils and highly oxidizable seed oils or cottonseed oil in these foods. It could be the other chemicals that come along with them, because many of these foods are packaged in plastic. They might get hot in transport. They're sitting on shelves. They have stabilizers. They have things to increase shelf life that prevent microbial breakdown. All these problems you don't get when you cook your foods from scratch. And I know this sounds like a repetitive message, but we need to be reminded of this over and over again. They go on to say, beyond nutritional factors, ultra-processed food intake may elevate the risk for coronary artery disease by introducing neoformed contaminants during food processing. For example, acrylamide and acrolein are two compounds that are found to be associated with elevated rates of coronary artery disease risk. Processing of food can alter the structure of food, which influences its functionality and bioavailability of nutrients. The modified structure of foods, in combination with their poor nutritional qualities, such as low fiber content, are likely to facilitate faster eating rates and higher energy intakes through the alterations of satiety and glycemic responses, which have been linked to major cardiovascular disease risk factors such as obesity and diabetes. They also talk about how food additives used in ultra-processed foods may also play a role in the elevations of coronary artery disease risk observed in our study. Research has shown that different peptides and glycosaminoglycans, etc., which are often used in chicken broth products to induce a lasting savory taste, are found to be associated with diabetes and progression of arterial stiffness. Monosodium glutamate, MSG, is another glutamate metabolite that is used as a food additive and has been shown to lead to atherosclerosis and other coronary artery disease in animal experiments. Some studies have indicated that excess dietary phosphorus consumption, especially inorganic phosphate, which is higher in ultra-processed foods, is associated with vascular calcification and increased risk of other cardiovascular outcomes. Non-caloric sweeteners such as ACE-K have also been found to accelerate atherosclerosis in cellular models. So there's multiple different mechanisms here. Is it the seed oils? Is it the refined carbohydrates? Is it the, white flours and so forth? Probably a combination, plus these novel chemicals that are designed to increase the palatability and the taste profiles of these foods, which are problematic. So again, the take-home message is really quite simple. A large percentage of the deaths here in the U.S., 630,000 of the some odd, I want to say 3 million people that die every single year here in the U.S. come from coronary artery disease related complications and cerebrovascular disease like strokes. These are all bucketed into the same death counts. These outnumbered deaths from COVID-19 all throughout the pandemic 2-1. So it's really important that if you want to live a long, healthy life, that you start to eat whole real foods, because these ultra-processed foods, the sugary snacks, sugar-sweetened beverages, oils, and baked goods are part of the problem, as well as alcohol. So, my friends, stick to whole real foods. Again, I'm very grateful that you tuned all the way through. I will link this article in the show notes here. The title, for those of you driving, again, is Higher Ultra-Processed Food Consumption is Associated with Risk of Incident Coronary Artery Disease in the Atherosclerosis Risk in Communities Study, a 27-year follow-up study finding that atherosclerosis is in part initiated independently and linearly with the amount of processed foods that you consume. So make your whole real foods at home from scratch when possible. Avoid some of these processed foods when you're going out in public, or especially for your children. I mean, this is what's really, I think, damaging to children's health now is all of the candy bars and the sugar sweetened beverages and stuff. I just picked my daughter up the other day from basketball practice, and there's just junk food and candy wrappers and Pop-Tarts and all sorts of treats and chips. Not good stuff for children, right? We don't want them developing atherosclerosis at such an early age. And there's connections with ultra-processed food consumption and depression, ultra-processed food consumption and hair loss, accelerated aging. The list goes on. So the take-home message, thankfully, is simple. Eat more whole, real foods. As always, I appreciate you tuning all the way through. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for hitting that like button, and we'll catch you on a future episode down the road.